Hello, I'm Paul O'Kelly, just retired editor of the local news group and now editor of DublinChampion.ie. If you told me just a few days ago that I was going to walk into that booth on Friday and vote for Heather Humphreys, I'd say, well, you really don't know anything about me or my opinion of Heather Humphreys. Well, what am I going to do? Obviously, vote for Catherine Connolly for all sorts of reasons, mainly to do with my dislike of how Heather Humphreys handled the situation about the Moore Street and Moore Lane battlefield sites commemorating 1916. Now, wild horses wouldn't have dragged me into that booth to vote for Heather Humphreys because of that and other related issues. Now, not only am I going to vote for her, I'm going to campaign for her and do my best to switch people, especially those committed to Catherine Connolly, away from Connolly and towards Humphreys. Why? Well, it's very simple. I know that the issue about how Catherine Connolly represented British banks trying to repossess homes from Irish people has blown up in the last few days, but it seems to me that most people have missed the point. She was able to rebut any criticism of her barrister's representation of those repossession hearings on the simple basis that the Bar Council have what they call the cab rank rule. Now, the implication behind the cab rank rule is just as if you go up to a cab in, say, Stephen's Green and say, well, look, I'm sorry, but I'm only going to Camden Street or Rathmines, and he wants to hold out for an airport fare. Well, that's tough luck. He has to give you the $7 or $8 fare. He can't hold out for the $40. That's the cab rank rule. And in a similar, but not exactly the same way, the Bar Council does not want barristers refusing criminals, those who've committed what they would consider to be obviously unpopular and despicable crimes, and so on. They want to make sure that there is access to justice, even for the most despised, even for the most unpopular. And that's very, very noble and very, very proper. But I'm afraid the Bar Council's cab rank analogy breaks down in that, quite rightly, they have built in exceptions to this rule that there is an obligation to represent. And there's a number of exceptions. Any one of which, and all of which, many of which, several of which certainly would have applied in Catherine Connolly's case. The first, and this is the most crucial, is the conscience exception. If you feel that particularly in a civil case, where there's no danger of a criminal, guilty or innocent, serving time when he shouldn't, and when there's no such moral issue at stake, in a civil case, if the case being taken by, in this case, the bank, is repugnant to you, then you can cite a desire not to represent them on moral or conscience grounds. And there are other get-outs as well, such as you can claim that you don't have the expertise, or your diary is too full, or you're not happy with the fee, or whatever. So even if she didn't have the conscience clause to rely on, she would have been able to give what you might call a soft refusal. Now, let's just be clear about this. For most people, however we handled the banking crisis and the horrific crisis thereafter that involved many repossessions, most civilized people would say that however we solved it, we would say no repo. Solve it any way you like, put people on a payment plan, have a government intervention of some kind, but no repo. Now, Catherine Connolly had a choice, and when you go into that polling booth on Friday, be absolutely clear. Don't let her supporters tell you, and Fine Gael have been very slow in rebutting this, that in some way the Bar Council's cab rank rule gives her a free pass. She couldn't have said no. Catherine Connolly could have said no to repo. She could have said no to the attempt at repo by those British banks, and she didn't. I have less quarrel with her for doing that, because maybe she was a young barrister on the way up, maybe she needed the money, maybe there was a conflict in her mind between the case itself and the fact that she needed to make a name for herself. All that's permissible. What was not permissible was her to try to represent to the Irish electorate that she had no choice. She had a choice. And what was also not tolerable, in my view, was to regard, as a newspaper columnist said a couple of days ago, regard questions about her representations of those would-be repossessors as being impertinent, as being, as she put it, a new low or a slur. No, sorry, Catherine, in this election campaign, you have an obligation to answer to the electorate. No such question is a new low. No such question is an attempt at a smear. It's not a smear, it's a question. And if you'd answered openly, you would have said, yes, I did have the choice. I did have the option of saying no. I could have said no to repo or no to an attempt at repo, and I didn't. Well, I say no to repo. And if you say no to repo, then you might reconsider any suggestion of voting for Catherine Connolly. And whatever your quarrel with her, you might do, and I have plenty of quarrels with Heather Humphreys, but it's Heather Humphreys that I'm voting for because I don't like the way that Catherine Connolly has handled this issue. And I particularly dislike her dismissals of questions about it and her suggestion that she did it because she had to. Sorry, Catherine, you had a choice. You didn't say no to repo, and you could have done.